Okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this interview with Niklas Törneke. He is a Swedish psychiatrist and psychotherapist, originally trained in cognitive therapy, but since 1998, he has been a well-known internationally ACT trainer and supervisor. Also, he's an author of the ABC Human Behavior with Jonas Ramnerö. I hope I said it correctly.
Yeah.
And also learning RFT and the book Metaphor in Practice. Thank you very much for accepting to take this interview. And most of all, thank you for agreeing to host the Metaphor webinar for us this October.
Okay.
In fact, this interview is mainly an introduction for the webinar, which will be on 9th of October, 10 a.m. And we were hoping that for the next year, we will be able to organize a small conference with the main workshop hosted by you. And this to be the start of developing ACT in Romania at a new level.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for inviting me to all this and having me in this process. I'm really, I must say, curious about the situation in Romania and you know, the psychotherapy situation and in general, and of course specifically with ACT. Maybe I can just start by introducing myself a little bit more, saying, you know, well, actually, my basic training in psychotherapy, this is back in the late 80s, was from a psychodynamic framework. It's, you know, reading David Malan, Kernberg, Kohut, all these different. So that was my introduction, really, and I still remember the first book I read. It was by David Malan. I think it was Psychotherapy and Psychodynamic Science or something like that. It was a very good book. I still recall some things from it. So this was where I started, and then I met what was then called cognitive therapy, as you mentioned, end of the 80s. And to me, as a psychiatrist, what I think attracted me with the cognitive sort of model was that it was easier for me to sort of use it in all kinds of situations. You know, from my point of view or my experience, the psychodynamic setup gave me tools for sort of understanding. And of course, tools for more specific therapy. But in the general interaction with all kinds of different clients, it was hard to sort of use this for you know, ordinary consultations, shorter consultations, that kind of thing. So the cognitive model, I was attracted to it because I could sort of use it all the way from consultations that maybe were just 1 or 2 sessions, all the way to therapy, basically. So this is, and then I had my basic training in this, basically the Beckian model with all kinds of, you know, additions, types, and what eventually was called cognitive behavioral therapy then. That was actually the, during that training, I was sort of more confronted with a more behavioral approach. I was a little bit, you know, I didn't have much of that at all in my background. But it, you know, I started to have some supervision from behavior therapists, and so there were things that I sort of picked up there, and then eventually but I worked as basically a CBT therapist for some years.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Then in 1998, as you mentioned earlier, I went to a conference on Ireland, actually, where I met, you know, Steve Hayes and Herbert Barnes-Holmes and those people. And I was, that was my first contact with ACT, basically. And then, of course, I got involved in that. Yeah.
How you see the main difference between ACT and CBT, or other therapies.
Okay.
What is specific in ACT? Would you say it's only ACT has, if it's something like that?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that are stressed very much in ACT. And I think the key concept, if you want to go to one specific thing, I think it's the idea or the term diffusion, really, which is a technical term in ACT, but it has to do with how you interact with your own private responses, like how you interact with thoughts, feelings, memories, bodily sensations. And I think that, of course, eventually ACT has become more like, a set model amongst other models. Mm-hmm. For me, I was always from the start attracted to ACT, not really as a specific model different from others, but more like some basic principles. And I think that when I started to use ACT, it wasn't that I sort of switched. No, I used to work with CBT and then I started to work. No, it's not. It wasn't like that at all. I still kept my basic, understanding of things, and then I added on a few things. And I would say the focus, if I have a guess on what people will say in 20 years, if you ask in 20 years, this ACT stuff, what was the central thing? I would say, I think it was the focus on what in ACT is called diffusion. Which has to do with how you interact with your what is in behavioral language would be called private responses or private behavior. But just thoughts, feelings, memories. So that's what
It's interesting because this was what attracted me to ACT too. That they use mindfulness a lot, and the other thing is diffusion, because diffusion you can do without mindfulness actually. First of all, I understand that only with mindfulness it's possible, but after I realized that it's a lot of other ways to use diffusion.
Yeah. And I think that, there's a lot of ACT was not, in a sense, you could say this is not unique to ACT. It's more a question of emphasis, I think. Because you can, as you say, you will have this phenomena inside the mindfulness movement. There are lots of overlaps. You can even go to traditional psychodynamic therapy, look at, for example, the idea of the observing ego, some of the self-psychology. There are overlaps, and I don't think there are dividing lines like that. But there is still. It's not the same thing as saying that everything is the same. I don't think everything is the same, but I don't think there is direct dividing lines. It's overlaps, and there's a question of emphasis, I think.
Yeah, I just listened recently webinar in Jungian psychotherapy, analytical psychotherapy, because this is our basic training. And I was surprised they start to talk about ego as a process, and it was a lot of overlapping what I heard in ACT or in RFT. So I think in this our postmodern era, it's a lot of overlapping everywhere. So
I think so.
Because this is the other question, what will remain? Because now psychotherapy is changing so fast, and all the time new models appear. And this was my second question, but about this, but you already answered that diffusion may be something that will appear. And diffusion, it's also appear in some spiritual approaches. This is it's not new. It's very far. It's very old.
Yes, I think I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
The idea then would be that the contribution, I would say, from this perspective, both from ACT and from relational frame theory, is to apply a bit more strict scientific assumptions and working on it more specifically and scientifically, with the hope that this will actually improve the psychotherapy more generally. I think
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
This was my surprise regarding ACT, because, for example, I had some preconception regarding behavior approaches, because, you know, in the university, you learn about Watson and this kind of stuff, and you say, okay, well, this is, I don't really resonate with this kind of stuff. But later on, when I read my first book about ACT, and I realized that it was a Ruth Harris book, I realized that even I can find spirituality, spiritual ideas in ACT, but of course, it put in scientific context, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, so it's an interesting. For me, it was a very good surprise, and yeah. If you,
Speaking of,
yeah.
sorry,
No,
you
go
mentioned
ahead.
RFT. That you mentioned the RFT, and speaking of RFT, if you can tell us a few words about it, especially for the people who never heard of it or they get very little in touch of it, why it's important, and that we know that the relation frame theory is the theory on which ACT is based on. But can we work with that without knowing RFT, for instance?
Yeah. Okay, let me say something first about what RFT is, or relational frame theory overall. Now, it's a theory. It's a theory of language from a behavioral perspective, you can say. And I think, and it's an effort to try to understand really one of the, well, obviously most fundamental things in all human interaction. What's going on right now, for example. You know, I'm sitting here right now. I'm uttering a series of combinations of sounds, right? I do some other things. I move my hands a little bit and stuff. But most of it, I mean, it's obvious that the pronunciation of a lot of different sounds and the combination is what primarily is occurring now. And as I do that, you do something also. You do what we call, you know, understand. You listen, and you understand. So these combinations of sounds affect you in a particular way, right? Now, and then and obviously, for anyone interested in psychotherapy, this is very central. This is key, right? I mean, therapy is a lot, well, not exclusively, but very much a talking cure, right? That's the traditional term, right? And then, which means, of course, that if you're interested in how does therapy work, the issue of language is key, right? How can we affect each other this way? I mean, of course, obviously, therapy is just a small part of that. I mean, it's all human interaction includes this, but therapy is a special type of this interaction. And then you ask, how does it work? And of course, that in a sense, you could say it's a strange thing that this question is rarely answered within any psychotherapy context. And there wasn't even an effort. You know, we just take it for granted, right? Because of course it's a natural part of our everyday life in all kinds of ways. So we just, okay, it works to talk. But how does it work? Now, RFT is a scientific account of trying to understand that process, basically. And of course, this is a much wider thing than therapy. Therapy is just a small part of human life, right? But it's an essential part. So that is in ordinary terminology what RFT is. There's a lot of basic research, laboratory research, trying to sort of describe these kind of processes, what people actually do when we language, right? And one of the basic ideas is that the key repertoire that we use is a particular way of relating. So that's sort of a general idea of what this is. Then, of course, to go into it is another matter, but that's the idea. The basic idea is actually it's a science about a particular way of relating, which is key to human behavior, and which is, you know, in common sense words, is called language. Language between people, but also, which is also relevant for psychotherapy, of course, the fact that we talk a lot to ourselves. The inner dialogue, or whatever you want to call that. It's part of this. Thinking is part of this. Remembering is part of this. There's all kinds of things. So just to say that is to say something about relational frame theory. Then, of course, then your question, can you do ACT without this scientific understanding? Yes, I think you can. You can sort of use ACT as more, you know, like a model, and you do ACT basically as you would do other kinds of therapy models, following certain, you know, instructions and certain ideas. But if you really want to understand it, and if you think that understanding it might improve the way you do it, then I think RFT has something to offer. But you don't, it's not a must. I don't think so. Even though I you know, I would, personally, it's meant a lot to me to sort of understand what I'm doing, or trying to understand what I'm doing. So.
When we talk about language, we think about the verbal language, but language can have different other, for example, different gestures can be language too. But I'm very curious about, maybe it's not very related, but about your opinion about this, that before we learn language, verbal language, do you think we have already some kind of language, some kind of structure, how we structure our experiences and stuff, and that if you can say it's a language?
I think that traditionally there's been a lot of dividing between sort of, you know, once you talk about the verbal, and then you talk about what, well, there are different terms used. Bodily language is one typical term, right? Now, and traditionally, these two have been considered sort of kind of like two systems, more or less. I think that's a mistake, and I think that that's supported by you know, neuroscience today. If you look at neuroscience, it's more and more the connection between the body and the verbal is very strong, and that goes. And I think there's a lot of support for that outside of RFT, just, you know, in general neuroscience, cognition as bodily enactment. You have all these kinds of, there's a lot of support, I think, for the idea that it's more like one system actually, which I think is also the position of RFT. The relating that is assumed in RFT to be at the root of language is also at the root of bodily language. Now, of course, not from the start. I mean, we of course, you could say that, if you want to say that for a newborn infant has a certain body language, you could say, but you can also say that birds have a certain language, right? So it depends a little bit on how you use the words and the terms. But I think that from my perspective, it's like this. Of course, you have languages in this way. Birds have languages, and you can say that human infants have certain languages when they're born, whatever that is. You know, maybe, you know, it's hard to say how that works, but of course you could say that. And at the same time, once you learn the repertoire of relational framing, which humans learn, it's not from the start, it's a learned ability, but of course we cannot learn to fly with our arms, and it seems like other species than humans cannot learn the type of language that humans learn. And at the root, according to RFT, is this way of relating. And that is the backbone of traditionally verbal, but also at the background of traditionally bodily language. If you look at linguistics today, for example, there's a lot of things written about this, that spoken and gesture actually go together in many specific ways. So that's I think the position also of RFT.
Okay, it's very interesting. Yeah, I think some kind of predisposition, at least to learn this predisposition to learning, I think it's already we have at the moment we
of course. So I mean, of course, there's how could it be differently? I mean, of course, why would we learn this so quickly if there was no biological base? Of course, there's a biological base, and so
yeah.
So there's a predisposition, but still a lot of learning. This is a traditional conflict, right, between behaviorism and say Chomsky and
yeah.
Some of
I'm not very familiar with his work, but yes, okay. This is also in Jungian psychotherapy. It's also a problem with archetypes, and archetypes are innate or it's not, or okay. It's I don't know if you are familiar with this idea of archetype.
Yes. I'm not in detail, but of course, yeah, but I'm
okay.
Young.
Because very complex stuff, after we know the human genome, it's clear that it's a very limited quantity of information which is inherited. So of course it can be innate, but something very, very basically, like for a predisposition to learn something easily, and maybe to learn something else a little bit, it would be a little bit more difficult.
One thing that actually connects also to this, to the other, you could say that this is actually connects a little bit to the specific area that's going to be in focus on the webinar, the metaphor, the use of metaphor. Okay. Because if you look at modern linguistics and metaphor, there seems to be a lot of metaphors that are very extremely common in all. There are similarities between, you know, languages that are not connected at all or very little. And many linguists refer to that there are basic human experiences, like, you know, and experiences with the body. I mean, just, you know, all humans interact with their body, and there are some limitations as to what can be done, right? And so this could be connected to the archetypes. I mean, of course.
Yes, exactly.
You know, the body and so what, you know, and the body is innate, I guess. We get that from the start, and we all have it, more or less. I mean, there are. You know,
it's some.
So there are a lot of connection points you could argue there. I don't know.
Okay. So if you can talk a little bit about your latest book, Metaphor in Practice.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it has two basic sort of influences. One is relational frame theory again, because obviously metaphor is a type of talking, right? It is a type of languaging. And it's verbal. It is also, this is interesting in the connection once again between what is traditionally called verbal and the body, because a lot of metaphors are obviously using the body, you know, and our experience of the body. So from an RFT point of view, there is an analysis of how metaphor works within RFT. But then, so that was where I came from. And then in the old, for me personally, I had an old interest in metaphor. I grew up with you know, the Bible, poems, that kind of thing in my home, my parents' home. So, and there's a lot of metaphor there. So I was interested, and then RFT and language. And then when I started to think about it a bit more, I started to read modern linguistics, because of course, obviously, the main scientific department that deals with is linguistics, right? That deal with metaphor. And there was where did we, yeah, where did you lose, you know?
Well, where you start to talk about linguistic, and yeah.
Okay. Well, basically, I mean, I came from a behavioral act. Well, one thing to mention is, of course, that ACT. Yeah, I came from that. And in ACT, there is an emphasis on using metaphor in therapy, right? I mean, metaphor is considered important more or less in all kinds of therapy. Well, obviously in the Jungian tradition, there's a lot. This is connected to the archetypes, I guess, in different ways that I'm not aware of, but I assume. Yeah. And other specific therapies, you know, solution-focused therapy, family therapy, all these kinds of, and even psychodynamics, you can find a lot of talk about this. Especially today, maybe then a lot of even psychoanalysts would realize that, you know, the traditional models of Freud, they don't hold as scientific descriptions, but they might still have a lot to say as metaphors, right? Superego or unconscious, all these kinds of things. So but in ACT, it's emphasized a lot to use metaphor, and there's a lot of some ideas connected to that, connected to ACT. So this was what my background, I was interested, and then I started to read linguistics because I realized that that's the big scientific area of researching metaphor use, not in specific in therapy, but, you know, through life. When I read the stuff there, I realized there was a lot of overlap. And so that's sort of where I started. And then the book is an effort to try to combine what we know about metaphor from research and the more clinical ideas from behavior analysis, ACT, and specifically relational frame theory. So that's a kind of trying to
Actually, I think metaphor can work like a bridge between different approaches, because if you talk about this, I would say mainly it's an overlap in every therapeutic approach when they talk about. But I would be curious, what is your idea to use metaphors which is already I don't know, prepared, or, you know?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. There's been some research on that also, because most psychotherapy models, even though they sort of advise you to use metaphors, there's a strong tendency to sort of suggest metaphors. You know, metaphors created by the therapist or even by the model. You know, ACT has a lot of that, right? Now, I think, and then of course on the other side, if you realize that metaphor is basically everywhere in language, people use metaphors all the time. There are metaphors included in what we are doing now. Then you realize that there are metaphors that start with the client. Sometimes the client is aware that he's trying to say something metaphorical, but other times this is just language. This is just the way you talk. And there are, when you talk about your, oh, now let's see what happens here. Are you still here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
we are
good.
here.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah, the picture froze a bit. Well, I mean, when you in an ordinary dialogue, there's a lot of spontaneously used metaphors, both from the therapist and the client. Now, you could, of course, focus on that. See, when the client, for example, describes a problematic situation and uses a particular metaphor, maybe it's a wise thing to sort of catch it, to pick it up and try to do something with it. And I think, so that's on one side, using metaphors that just occur as the dialogue goes on. The other one is to introduce metaphors, or to and I think, and as far as we know from research, it seems that both of these can function well. I think the key thing is to be sensitive to to what extent a particular metaphor is actually helpful for the client. Of course, if it comes from the client, the guess is good that it is saying something, right? If it comes from the therapist, well, it could fit or not. So the key thing will be to sort of distinguish between.
Or the client can have a very different reaction that you expect.
Exactly.
And what you do in that situation, because then if you are not flexible, so.
Yeah, I think that what you should do is to try to explore the position of the client and not try to sort of convince the client that this is what this metaphor means. Of course, you know. So I think there's a key term here. It's therapy is cooperation. It's cooperation. Do something together. And the way you do something together is the way it's extremely important. I mean, this is also connected to the concept of alliance, right? The term
alliance.
Yeah. I prefer the term cooperation simply because it sort of stresses that this is something we do together. Alliance is also something we do together, so it's the same thing, I think. But the risk is that you sort of, the idea from alliance is that it's some kind of mystical thing that's sort of, you know, in the air or something. But because it's a result of your interaction. There's no other.
Yeah, of course, when a client is going to therapy, they will put you very often in an up position. So it's good if you somehow normalize the relationship and maybe like a teamwork or something like that. It put more on a level of equality. So, Raluca, maybe you would like to ask something?
Yes, when we speak about metaphors, I could not help myself wondering about symbols and what is the connection between symbols and metaphor, especially from an RFT point of view. Because already when it comes to symbol, the approaches can be very different.
Yeah, I think that from an RFT perspective, these different things rely on the same basic principles. Because terms like, even if you look in metaphor research and in linguistics, there are different terms used. Metaphor is the most common one, and you have the other one, analog, which is a sort of similar term. And these are not so well defined. And there's a lot of other technical terms that make different kind of distinctions, like simile on one hand and metaphor on the other. So if I say, for example, that Stefan is a rising star. Okay. That's according that. But if you compare that to say, I say Stefan is a rising star, or I say Stefan is like a rising star.
Okay.
Now, the only difference there is that you put in like rather than just, right? And if you're technical here, in many accounts, traditionally, especially in philosophy and some linguistics, you would call the first Stefan is a rising star, a metaphor, and Stefan is like a rising star, is a simile. Now, from an RFT perspective, though, that's not. There are differences between those two things, sure, but it doesn't. It's not functionally totally different, and that's the same thing if you look at linguistics. That most research don't use this kind of exact. Definitions, and symbol would be to look at it more clearly, you will need an example, I think, to see sort of the difference and the similarities. At least if you have a little bit more advanced symbol, it would function as a metaphor, I think, from an RFT perspective.
Yeah.
But the problem here is that most of these terms in ordinary language, like metaphor, symbol, whatever, are not so exactly defined.
No.
So it's hard. If you ask hard questions, it will be difficult, because if you look on RFT, you can see there is a definition, but that's not the most common definition in ordinary terms.
No. And it's difficult here. I think when we talk about symbols, there are big differences between different approaches. For example, a Jungian approach, which is in a lot of different language and different approaches, would say symbol in Jungian will be only a sign. I mean, a sign or something.
Okay.
It's not a symbol in Jungian terms. In Jungian terms, symbol, it also has a unconscious part that you explore, but you never can explore fully. I don't know. It's always something more. So this is a symbol. It has some concrete meaning in our like ordinary, usual life, I should say. But it has another meaning, which is, I would say, a little bit, not a little bit
subtle.
Yeah, subtle.
Okay. Yeah.
You feel some emotions maybe about that. Maybe it can be a object or something. So and you don't know why, or and you can explore something like that. But of course, all this you will do metaphorically, because you don't have any other tool.
Yeah.
So symbol will be, you should explore it metaphorically, because you cannot do otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Yeah.
And Jung always said that the mind or psyche, it's mythopoetic. What does it mean for him? That he creates metaphors all the time.
Yeah.
And myths, but myths also, they are kind of metaphors actually.
Yeah.
So the metaphor is still very important, also in Jungian approach. Okay.
Yeah, there is. It's interesting, because of course the Jungian tradition has spent a lot of time on these issues. I think compared to some other schools. So I'm sure there's a lot of overlap and a lot of things where you can sort of dig in. Then of course the question is, on the other side, is the more practical thing. Okay, so what are you supposed to do when you sit with the client, right? And I think in the webinar, we will try to focus that a little bit also, to have, some general things about metaphor and what we know, and then what does this mean in what should you keep as a kind of a rule of thumb? How are you gonna interact with clients using this? So, well, that's.
So in webinar, you will give some practical tools from people.
Yeah. Of course, there will not be so much. If it had been in live, there could be more time to practice and illustration. This would be didactic, right? I mean, this is, I present this stuff. So, but it will be like it will be a tasting.
That's good.
Which is obviously a metaphor, right? Because you're not going to, right? There's no food presented, and still, of course, you will taste something. But maybe, hopefully, as you said, in the future, we can have the real meal. We will see.
We will see, because, And would be an interesting question. I don't know if you would like to go in this direction or not, but how you see all this, what's happening now in the world, from an ACT, RFT, or metaphorical perspective.
Okay.
Maybe metaphorical perspective, but only if you are comfortable. If not, it's not problem.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. Could be maybe a few examples, but I think but I haven't spent much time actually trying to set my mind on that. But of course, there are things you can, you know, there are a lot of things that, as life in a whole, there's a lot of metaphors actually used in this. Of course, some helpful and some problematic, probably. So it's,
yeah. Somehow in my mind always popping up this idea of a mirror somehow.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't want to go maybe in too much details, but this is somehow, it's for me, this is a metaphor which
Okay. Yeah.
Regarding
So if this turned up in therapy, and it seemed to be a central issue, then I would ask you, what kind of mirror is that mirror?
And I will answer something more symbolically, maybe a mirror of truth, where you can see the reality, how it is.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Yeah.
Or a
Or
mirror
maybe
of teaching, because
mirror
there
of
is
teaching.
a big lesson here for us to learn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the way it works.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, this if this analysis of metaphor use holds in other situations, of course, it's central to what's going on with this pandemic and our different ways of dealing with it and the problems occurring and whatever. This is part of human life. So, I mean, and quite problematic. Yeah.
Maybe one question about metaphors, that how the culture influenced the metaphors and the way of thinking, because I think between, for example, between East and West, we have a very different, not very different, but a different way to put. And I think if I remember well, because the book I read when it was out, so but I think you touched this idea about different culture and how in, for example, I think it's an example in China about past and present and something.
Oh yeah, that's true. Our way of metaphorically talking about time. Yes, I think it's you know, there are things that seem to be very similar in most countries or most languages. Then there are things that are different. And that goes all the way from, you know, the East-West, like you mentioned, but also, you know, if you would compare probably Romanian culture with Swedish culture, there are some things, you know, where things would be sort of acted upon differently because of our different metaphorical ways of relating to things. But that you can go to Sweden and you know you can go down to the family. There's a difference between my family and my neighbor's family in the way of some things working. So I think, of course, if you live in the same culture, there will be more similarities. And if you come from different cultures, it might be bigger differences. But there's always both differences and similarities, I think. So that's why you have to explore.
Yeah, like you said, finally we have a body, and finally we can find a way to connect to each other, even though in a certain level there are differences. But I think if we're going down and down, we can find a way to connect and to find that the human problems are everywhere similar.
And that, of course, is very important, I think, because we live in a time where there's a lot of there's a strong tendency in many ways, but also politically, to stress differences, right? To stress differences. And so I think just to remind ourselves of our similarities it's extremely important from daily life to great political issues, you know.
Yeah, very
we need to remember we're the same species.
Yeah. Well, I think, this is a difficult stuff, I realize.
Oh, yeah. Definitely so.
Okay. So, Raluca, if you would like to ask something or to say something, maybe slowly we will
yes, just wanted to say that I hope this was, as you mentioned, a taste for the webinar, and the webinar a different taste for the real deal. And thank you for being with us here today. And it was an honor for me to listen to you now, what you have had to say.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was a nice chat, and looking forward to this webinar, and we'll be in touch before that. So
of course.
Definitely.
Okay. So I would like to say also thank you, and it was an honor for me too, and it was a very interesting talk and discussion, dialogue, and I hope we will have another one maybe sometimes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. If you would like to say something or in the end,
that's fine. Thank you.
Okay,
it's also an honor for me to be invited like this, and people are, to have the experience that people are interested in what you think and what you say. That's an honor, right? Because that's something.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you all your work and everything. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.